Good morning, everyone. We still probably have some people struggling in issues with parking, which is always kind of the norm over here. So I'm Jeanette Cordova, and I'm the new co-chair with Corey. I think most people know who I am, but for those who don't, I am the parent of a soon-to-be 16-year-old young teenager who is was born with Down syndrome. I'm also on the Colorado Developmental Disabilities Council as the vice chair, and now on Cando. So Corey asked me to just give a brief update, so I'll do this really quickly because we are starting a little late on Spark. So the mission of Spark is an online research partnership involving 50,000 individuals with autism and their families. We want to speed up research and advance understanding of autism. One of the things that we wanted to kind of clarify, because there's still some confusion as to who can participate. The person has to live in the United States and their family, has to be at the current time be able to read English. It is not translated into Spanish yet, but I am keeping a list of any family who is interested. So once the Spanish consenting is done, I'll be able to call the families back. An independent adult with autism spectrum, or biological or adoptive or legally authorized representative, legal guardian of a child, dependent with adult with ASD, biological sibling with or without can participate and are invited as well. And then the main thing is they have to have a diagnosis, and that could be medical or educational. So if the child has not been medically diagnosed, they can still participate with an educational evaluation. Turn slide. Thank you. Oh, I do it. Never mind. Thank you. I forgot. I just don't see the button. About 18,089 people with autism are participating in Spark at the current time. This was the year one that went through May. I believe we're actually at 20,000 now, and maybe higher. Where's the, there it is. Oh my God. Yeah, come on. I am obviously challenged today.
No, I think it's that. On the bottom left-hand corner.
Okay, let's try that. Not showing on my end.
Sorry, you're right.
It's bien. And I'm usually the AV person, so I don't know what's wrong with me this morning. Right now, this kind of gives you a snapshot as of May who is participating. So we have about 15,302 children with autism. We have about 2,787 adults. The ratio of males to female in adults over 18 is about 2. And the ratio in males to females in children under 18 is 4 to 1.
And this is nationwide.
This is nationwide. Since this is a national, this is including information and data from the 20 sites at that time. We actually have 22 sites across the United States now. I believe that she also sent this to you, so I'm not going to read it all, but I really just wanted to highlight a few things. Come on.
It'll be on the website.
Oh, and it'll be on the website. All right, it's not showing me the thing again. There it goes. Oh, wait, went too far. All right, so boys and girls were diagnosed on an average between ages 4 and 4.5 based on the folks that are enrolled right now. On average, children enrolled in Spark seem to have been diagnosed a little later than those in other autism studies. This may be because it's from a larger sample of the US, because this is not just Colorado. You can see where they received their diagnosis. So on the right side of your slide, it says 51 from a healthcare team, specialist was 43%, clinical psychologist, team at school was 38%, which I was surprised how high that was, and pediatricians. So the average age when adults, males were diagnosed is 14, and the average age again, this is nationwide. The average age of adult females was 15.8. So the percent with birth complications was 7%. The percent born prematurely was about 12%. Some of the associated conditions with children with autism are on the right-hand side, which was the highest, 32% was ADHD, 41% with eating problems, 16% cognitive impairment, and you can kind of read the rest. 6.6 were seizures. Some other associated conditions, were 29% diagnosis of depression, 35% have anxiety disorder, and again, another 35% with ADHD. It kind of shows who had past genetic testing for autism. And basically, you know, what we're learning is we still have more to learn. So this one, we should be getting another report for the end of May. And so I'll try to do an update in the future on that one. So now I'd like to, if anybody has questions or online, because I forget we have online peeps. No. We are still enrolling. We are enrolling in clinic if they're coming for their appointment. We are enrolling at JFK if they need an appointment at night. And I'm also doing some home enrollment for those that it's a little difficult for them to get into the clinic to do the enrollment. And it's a really easy process, takes about 30 to 45 minutes. So. All right, with no questions, it is my pleasure to introduce the Director of Advocacy at the ARC of the United States, which is, the ARC of Colorado, look at me. Well, I just upgraded her position. The ARC of Colorado, Heidi, I forgot your last name. Haynes. So she's coming up right now.
Thanks, Jeanette.
I know, man. I just upgraded.
You have faith in me.
With premonition of what's going to happen in the future.
Well, thank you very much. Okay. So while she's doing that, my name is Heidi Haynes, and I am the Director of Advocacy at the ARC of Colorado. And I'm excited to kind of go over the legislative priorities that were developed by the ARC executive directors here in the state of Colorado, and then approved by the ARC of Colorado Board of Directors as we move into this 2017 session, which is going to be starting here shortly. And everyone's already working hard on getting bills set to go for the first few weeks. Yesterday, or during this week, the JBC's been, the Joint Budget Committee has been meeting, and they met with HICPUF this week, so I have some information about that as well. So we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. Oh, is that? Okay. Okay, so first and foremost, our first priority is funding and policy changes to strengthen the Colorado Medicaid state plan, state programs, and the HCBS Medicaid waivers for people with disabilities to include support for. So this is kind of our dream, what we would really hope to see this year, and then we try and do legislation that comes as close to this as possible. Changes in Colorado statute where needed to comply with the requirements established in federal law for home and community-based settings. We would like that to be congruent with what are actually in the federal law, and sometimes that's not the case. Therapeutic out-of-home placement and intensive treatment options for children with IDD and serious health, mental health, and behavior conditions. I'm going to take just a minute to go off here. So one of the big exciting things that's happening in this session is that HICPUF is, and the Department of Human Services are jointly proposing moving the CHIRP waiver from DHS, from the Department of Human Services, to HCPAV. And they want to leverage the existing CHIRP waiver to develop a program to serve children and their families. The reason that they want to do an amendment to the existing CHIRP waiver as opposed to creating a whole new waiver is that the process is, it's a lot easier. And they're actually able to almost completely change the waiver. So the big changes that would happen if they're able to do that, they'd want to remove the child welfare eligibility requirements, both provider-based and service-based, for children who are neglected or abused. That's not the case for a lot of the families, almost all of the families that are actually utilizing that waiver right now. So the CHIRP waiver is often a barrier to services, so they want to eliminate that. They want to change provider qualifications to use the existing network of IDD providers, and they believe that that'll better leverage existing expertise and provide better community of care as these children age into the adult system. And like I said, they're moving the administration from CDHS to HCPAV. With the removal of the child welfare requirement, the Colorado Department of Human Services will no longer have the expertise to administer the waiver. So they've long been saying, what we do here at the Department of Human Services is we investigate neglect and abuse, and that's not what these kids need. So that'll go over to HCPAV. They're going to change case management from children and welfare agencies to CCBs. They are already charged with determining eligibility, and they have the expertise in creating service plans for individuals with complex needs. And they want to add a transition service to the waiver to mitigate the need for out-of-home placement and facilitate returns to the homes once stabilized. So this is a really exciting one, and it really... Yeah.
I used to do church.
Did you?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it went from a cooperation on funding. I'm so sorry.
Oops, sorry, Corey. But, okay.
It's,
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful.
I'm keeping quiet. I worked doing placement through the CHIRP waiver for a CCB many years ago, and retired in 2009, so that gives you an idea of how many years ago it had been. And when it first started, it was going through the division in terms of the funding allocation went through there, and there would be referrals, yes, that came from the counties when there were, because that's how the out of home for the people under 18 had to happen. But then everything else flowed pretty well through the DD system. And then I don't know who and what changed things, but it turned about things, everything had to go through child welfare, and things changed, and you had to qualify people as foster parents through the foster care system, and the agencies that had been doing CHIRP placements had to get certification through the state as child placement agencies under the child welfare system. And for some parents, it was a huge obstacle because some counties were very cooperative and helpful to parents who were in dire need and needed to access this funding, and other counties did not. So I'm very happy.
Thanks.
Thank you, Corey. Thank you so much for that background on that. I know as long as I've been at the Arc of Colorado, since 2012, almost every year there's a conversation that happens in our office about what can we do to fix this. I'm really glad that the systems are the ones that are doing it now, because it's big system issue, and it's going to be much better for families. Does anyone on the phone or online have any questions about that? Okay, well, if you think of any, just let me know. I'll ask for questions again in a while. So the next one is 3, authorization and expansion of the Children's Mental Health Treatment Act to ensure that children with IDD are fully included and the wait lists are eliminated. And that's one that Mo Keller's been working on very closely, and we've been in discussions with her, and we're excited that we're going to be able to work with them to get that happening this year. The next one is full implementation of Colorado's Olmstead Plan, including implementation of strategies for integrated competitive employment. Again, that's one that we've already started working on, and Bob Lawhead will be here after me to talk some more about what they're doing around employment at the DD Council. Okay, next slide. Thank you. Okay, so these are funding and policy changes to strengthen the Colorado Medicaid state plan, state programs, and HCBS Medicaid waivers for people with disabilities to include support for continued. So these are all fall within that. Additional resources to implement Employment First in Colorado. Increased funding for respite and other services needed to maintain family stability. I know Megan's going to be here later, so she'll be able to talk about respite. Expansion of cross-system behavioral health crisis pilots. We'd like to see those expand to other areas. And we'd like some reassurance that all of that hard work will continue in the future with the state. Consistent standards for enrollment in HCBS DD waivers for emergency cases. This one is a huge deal, and I know we talk a lot about how along with aging caregivers, just that that's not an immediate entry into the DD comp waivers. You have to actually qualify as an emergency, and that's been a big barrier for people to be able to get into services. So we're trying to figure out some solutions with that with other stakeholder groups. Accelerated Medicaid waiver simplification to create a single HCBS waiver for all eligible adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities with access to services and supports. And waiver simplification is something we continue to work with stakeholder groups and task forces on. Expansion of inclusive higher education programs to Denver metro areas, Western Slope, and encourage future and current programs to attract support degree-seeking students. So we'll be working on that again this year. I know we've already had several meetings talking about what can be done this legislative session with for inclusive higher education. And then increased supported living services waivers levels with rate increases. So, okay, so our next big area is Colorado students with disabilities have a legal right to a free, appropriate educational opportunities in all public schools, including charter schools with accompanying supports for least restrictive environment. So Colorado must provide for adequate funding for public schools for inclusive student-centered programs for all students, alternatives to suspension and expulsion for young students. We are working to try and bring that bill back this year, as well as the elimination of corporal punishment in public schools. Special education services provided in the least restrictive setting by qualified teachers, staff, and therapists for all eligible students, including an appropriate continuum of services, paraprofessional supports, and related supports, including transportation. So we will continue this legislative session to try and work on all of that. And I know that we have ARC advocates every day that are working within their counties to try and ensure that that's happening for all of the students that they support, and for all students in general that are in those programs. So that one's not going away anytime soon. This is continued school, so adequate medical, nursing, and behavioral support services with appropriate staffing for students with complex needs. Meaningful transition services for students with disabilities that are person-centered and that prepare them for continuing education, work-based experiences resulting in competitive integrative employment, and successful community living. And maintenance of guaranteed access to public schools, including charter schools for all students. So education will be big on our priority list this year. I do. That would be for Advocacy Denver, and let me grab that for you really quick. I just need to pull it up. So their telephone number is 303-831-7733. And we just had somebody call the other day, actually from Atlantis, and they didn't know that the Advocacy Denver was an ARC chapter, but it actually is the Denver ARC chapter. And they have advocates for adults and for children. Thank you. Okay. Yep, thank you. Okay, so protection of civil rights for people with disabilities. So these are the priorities under that umbrella. Alternatives such as just supported decision-making to permanent restrictive protective arrangements, guardianship policies should respect the rights of people with disabilities to manage their own affairs with informal assistance and guidance from families, friends, and others. If guardianship is essential, it should be used only to the extent necessary with a presumption in favor of limited rather than full guardianship. So that kind of has shifted a little in the past few years. We kind of aligned that better with the ARC-US policy around that, and that was something that was developed with stakeholder feedback from people from all over the country. Policies for authorized representatives to ensure that the needs and choices of people with IDD are respected and honored. Right now, there's really no policies or rules around authorized representatives, so that can get a little confusing for people in the community to understand what exactly that authorized representative is authorized to do. So examination and reform of requirements for imposition of legal disability for persons at regional centers as well as those in community-based services. So I know anyone that resides at the regional centers currently requires an imposition of legal disability to reside there. So we'd like to kind of look closely at that. Next slide. Thank you, Dina. So school discipline policies that provide behavioral supports for students with disabilities that minimize restraint and involvement of law enforcement. So last year we tried to do a lot with schools. A lot of stakeholders did along with us, and we were able to get prone restraints banned in schools, but we weren't able to ban corporal punishment in schools, and we weren't able to pass the suspension and expulsion bill for children in second grade and lower. But that's definitely still very important to us, and we're gonna work again on that this year. I know we're excited to do that. Limited emergency interventions that address situations where a student's unexpected behavior poses a clear and present danger of serious physical harm to himself, herself, and others, and require that only staff currently trained and competent apply restraint and timeout interventions. We got a lot of information last year as we were going through this restraint and seclusion bills, so we definitely made that a more robust priority this year. And then fair treatment of juveniles with disabilities in the criminal justice system to avoid incarceration and implementation of restorative justice programs for all citizens. So, okay, so those are all of our legislative priorities for this year. So kind of what those are a framework, and we try and use those if an organization or a legislator, for that matter, comes to us to try and run a bill. We really try and make sure that it fits within that as we move through the legislative session. Let's see. So I'm just going to say some of the, sorry, too many things. So are there any questions from the phone or online? Okay, well, these slides will be available, and my contact information is here, so please feel free to call me if you'd like more information about any of those priorities or the CHIRP waiver that we talked about. I know one of the other things that Cristiano Sosa, our executive director, has been working really closely on is the employment, which Bob Lawhead is here to talk about. So that actually makes a really great segue.
Good morning, everyone. We don't have quite as many people in the audience as past times that I've been here, but it's nice to see everyone and present to those of you on the phone as well. So I've got about 45 minutes to speak with you. Um, and the way I had originally talked about doing this is to go ahead and try to give you quite a bit of content and then have a questions session at the end. But I certainly want people to feel free to ask a question either on the phone or here in the room at any time during this presentation of information. So please, this is informal, particularly with just what, a dozen people in the room here. So don't hesitate to interrupt me. So could we have the next slide, Dina? Thank you. So I wanted to let people know, can I walk around? No, okay. Got some glue? All right. So I want to let people know a little bit about what the Colorado Developmental Disabilities Council is all about. I've been their policy advisor now for several months, and not that I haven't been doing policy advocacy for a very long time, but changed positions here March 1st after working at an organization called Community Link for almost 3 decades as their CEO. And so now I'm orienting people about what the council does. The first bullet is our mission. And so you can see that we advocate in collaboration with and on behalf of people with developmental disabilities in Colorado for the establishment and implementation of public policy that will further their independence, productivity, and integration. There is a systems change focus to what the council does. So similar to the ARC of Colorado and the ARC chapters, we have an agenda that impacts how we do that advocacy in the state. And that guideline basically is our 5-year plan. And so the council every 5 years goes out to the community in Colorado, tries to get input from people with disabilities, their families, other people who may be associated with the system of services in Colorado, and try to determine what people's priorities are, what the priorities of citizens are. We also do some analysis about the system, try to look at some data, try to determine where there are gaps in services, where services are not working so well, and as a result, develop this 5-year plan. The current 5-year plan has 3 primary objectives. That is to develop leadership for people with disabilities and their families. It's the reduction of seclusion and restraint, as well as suspension and expulsion. So you heard Heidi talking about some of those priorities for the ARC of Colorado in those areas. Same thing with us. And finally, transition from school to an integrated life, which includes jobs, homes, recreation, basically all parts of a person's life. So that inclusion is another one of those primary drivers for what we do. The council is committed to inclusion, and that's built right into the Developmental Disabilities Assistance and Bill of Rights Act of 2000, which is what guides our activities as well. That act, if you go into it, creates the council, creates the University Centers for Excellence, like JFK, and creates the P&A, the Protection and Advocacy organizations around the country, which here in Colorado is Disability Law Colorado. So we are one of the sisters, one of the 3 sisters. I'm getting used to calling myself a sister. And we all try to work together to some extent at least. Next slide, please, Dina. Not cooperating? There we go. So I'm going to try to stand in front of this microphone so those of you on the phone can hear me. I like to walk around, and I'm not going to do that. So the next slide is talking about why Senate Bill 16-077 came into being. And it really was around concern. Again, as I said, the council analyzes how the system is doing. And so this particular bill came around after analysis of what's been happening in the system for several decades now around employment for people with disabilities, and in particular, what vocational rehabilitation refers to as people with the most significant disabilities. That includes people who are typically characterized as having a developmental disability, having an acquired brain injury, or having a mental health disability. And so basically looking at people who at times in the community are considered to be unemployable, and who we know through best practice, evidence-based practices that have been developed over the last several decades, that these individuals, if they desire to work, can work. It's a matter of accommodation. It's a matter of providing appropriate services and supports to those individuals as they seek employment and then continue to be employed. So part of the issue is that Colorado had a great deal of success 2 decades ago. We've had much less success since then in employing people with specifically intellectual and developmental disabilities. And part of this has raised concerns about Olmstead. Olmstead is the 1999 ruling by the Supreme Court that interpreted Title II of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, to basically say that people must be served, when state funds are used, people must be served in the most integrated setting possible. Well, that's not happening in Colorado, and it's not happening in any state perfectly. But because Colorado was quite successful in integrating people into the community, and I'm referring to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, into the community through employment back in the 90s, and because we've fallen back in our effectiveness in providing those services over the last several decades, Olmstead is a concern. And the reason it's a concern is that states are actively being sued by a variety of organizations, sometimes self-advocacy organizations, sometimes the protection and advocacy entities within a state. They're being sued for continuing to segregate people with disabilities. And so this issue of the fact that Colorado was quite successful in integrating people during the day through employment, now is not as successful, has brought about these concerns that, golly, Colorado may be open to one of these significant lawsuits because of the continued segregation that occurs in the state. So, and we'll go through these slides much more rapidly. This is all background. And some of the slides will hit the same information. So one of the primary concerns was the ongoing segregation and the concern that Olmstead versus LC would result in a possible lawsuit for the state. Another is that best practice services in the state are not being utilized at this point. Best practice evidence-based practices are not being utilized. As a result, the capacity of the service system for people with IDD is limited when it comes to regular integrated employment. Also, as compared to 2 decades ago, families and people with disabilities do not understand that individuals with significant disabilities have the capacity to be employed when the correct accommodations and service supports are provided. And finally, in the school system, expectations for students graduating out of high school are much lower than they ought to be, again, as a result of this lack of knowledge in the schools, in the adult system, and among people with disabilities and families in the state of Colorado about what the potential is when you appropriately apply supported employment and customized employment kinds of strategies for people with significant disabilities. Next slide, please. So I'm going to move into what some of the technical aspects are of this. What I just provided to you is why Senate Bill 77 happened. We're now going to talk a little bit about supported employment. It's basically paid work in integrated settings with ongoing support. It includes self-employment options. It includes customized employment, and job match is the focus. I'll tell you a couple quick stories. One is, one is of a person who I worked with several decades ago. He was an individual who had been in services here in Denver for a number of years. He had been kicked out of 3 different service agencies in Denver after doing property destruction and self-abuse. And there was the feeling that agencies just didn't know how to work with him. He came up to work with the agency that I eventually ended up leading, and within the first week kicked 6 holes in the wall right down a line of a hallway. And it was difficult for him to communicate what his concern was, but obviously he had concerns. He was frustrated. We started to be as concerned as some of these other agencies that had worked with him in the past, but we did have some conversation with him and were able to understand from him that the characteristics at the agency, and this was a sheltered workshop, this was a place where people with disabilities were gathered together in large groups in a factory type setting, very bright, no carpeting, all concrete floors, concrete walls, high ceiling, very noisy, with I don't know, 75 people in a relatively small space. He did fine for 2 days and then just went right down the wall and kicked half a dozen holes in the wall. As we debriefed, we started to understand that there was a sensory thing going on here. And he had a diagnosis of autism. And so we decided, gosh, let's get this guy into a quieter environment. We brought him out to IBM, where I was working as a crew supervisor. And this was in the 80s, so crews in those days were considered best practice because you had about 4 people, 5 people, 6 people out in a community business doing work. And so we integrated him into that setting. He worked with me supervising him as a staff supervisor within IBM. We put up chalkboards, we moved office equipment around, we repaired locks. Anyway, he did very well until late October, when he insisted to one of his coworkers that the Broncos were playing October 28th, and the coworker said, no, it's the 29th. Well, one of this guy's skills were numbers, and he said, no, it's the 28th. Well, they went back and forth for about a half an hour, and finally he just screamed at the top of his lungs, the Broncos play on the 28th. You don't know what you're talking about. Well, it just so happens this was a week after the White Plains incident, White Plains, New York incident at IBM, where one of the people at IBM went postal, basically came in with a gun, started shooting it. When the guards at IBM Boulder heard somebody screaming at the tops of their lungs, they came in with their guns ready to be discharged. And we were told at the end of the day that this gentleman was no longer welcome at IBM. Well, we went back and talked about it a little bit and realized that the congregate nature of group employment can bug people. And that's what happened with this young man. He basically couldn't tolerate the fact that he was interacting with another person with a disability who was misinformed. And there were also some aspects of the environment that were not quiet at times. We were all in manufacturing areas oftentimes in offices, but it wasn't ideal. Well, we thought about it a little bit and went to National State Bank in downtown Boulder. Excuse me. We went to National State Bank and told them that we thought we had a good candidate for a job that involved numbers. Because again, this person had some skills in numbers. What we were able to do was to get him a job as a coin processor, which basically was a job in the late 80s where you would take the coinage from parking meters, pour them into a machine. The machine would sort the nickels, dimes, quarters. And at the end of the day, you had to have all those rolls into the different boxes, and you had to give a count at the end of the day of how much money you had processed. This was ideal for him because he had fantastic skills with math. And we had to set it up where we asked coworkers to note when this individual became active, more active. His face started getting red. When they saw those signs, we were asking them to basically allow him to have a break, go down into the basement of the bank, and basically kick bathroom stalls when he got frustrated. He also, besides destroying property, would hit himself on the head, and that was a little concern because when we presented him as an employee, he had a bruise on his forehead, which was just another aspect of what happened when he became frustrated. Anyway, we had to support the employer pretty actively over the first several weeks and actually first several months, but then faded our assistance so that the assistance was minimal. And after 5 months, 6 months, he no longer had to go down to the basement to kick bathroom stalls. His coworkers basically were able to note when he needed a break and said, just, hey, it's time to take a break. Go ahead and relax a little bit. And he was able to do that and not be upset, not be destructive of property or to be self-abusive. Well, I can tell you now, Wells Fargo took over that bank, and he is now the longest tenured employee in that bank location. It's coming up on 30 years. And his job has changed some during that time, but he has been very, very successful. And part of it is because a bank is quiet. There aren't a whole lot of bright lights and activity happening in a bank. And so it was really a matter of finding the right job match for him. I'm going to tell you very briefly about Motorola and self-employment. This was an individual who actually is working down in Texas. And he's a person who only had one volitional movement, and that was this. He had no other movement. And for those of you on the phone, I just smiled a big Cheshire cat grin. That was his only volitional movement. And what he used for employment was a coffee cart, which had fancy, fancy coffee. You know, everybody likes coffee, and of course, coffee morphs into some other new flavor or new preparation as time goes on. He bought a state-of-the-art coffee machine, and basically was, as an entrepreneur, was self-employed with that machine and used it during the 4 morning shifts, the 3 afternoon lunches, and the 4 afternoon shifts, and made a pretty good living at doing that. Now, he had to have, as you might imagine, a personal care attendant with him at all times. And so that personal care attendant put in the additional coffee and cream and sugar and all the different stuff that had to go into that machine, helped him with ordering those supplies, provided personal care on the job because he was in a wheelchair. And as I say, was able to smile, but not much more. These are just 2 examples of people who are typically thought to be unable to work in a competitive environment. And the fact of the matter is that anyone can work in a competitive environment should they decide that they want to do that. And they don't have to work in a group like this gentleman did at first with me at IBM back in the early 80s, mid 80s. But with the right accommodations, with the right job match, people can work in regular community settings no matter how significant their disability. So let's move on. I'm gonna have to rip through these a little more rapidly. Okay, good. Good. I do have some extra time, Corey tells me. So customized employment is what this concept is called. It's a subcategory under supported employment. Remember, supported employment is 3 things: paid work, integrated settings, ongoing supports. And by integrated settings, now we mean basically regular work all this group stuff has gone by the wayside. Not to say that they aren't out there still, not to say that there still aren't sheltered workshops out there right now. But it's common knowledge that sheltered workshops are not best practice. It's common knowledge that enclaves or work crews, which are these groups of people that work in an employment setting, are not best practice. We're talking about one job, one person, the same way we all have jobs. And customized employment is how we do that. And this is a matter of this whole idea of accommodation. We are basically accommodating people in a way that makes sense for the business to get work done and makes sense for the individual employee to be able to get that work done. And so it may involve modifying a job description. It may involve changing a job schedule, for instance, from 8 hours to 3 hours. It may involve with the position description, looking at, instead of 10 duties that the person does, it may be just 2 duties within that position description, if that's what the person is good at and is capable of doing efficiently and effectively for that employer. So customization allows all people to work because you really are accommodating that job in a way that provides the work getting done that the employer needs and provides a good job match for that individual with a significant disability. Job training and ongoing support may be intensive initially, as it was with the gentleman in the bank, and then is faded over time, and typically goes to a level of, for many people, once or twice a month. For that individual that I described who was working at the bank, that went to once a month, where it was just a phone call to say, hey, how's George doing? Are things going okay? If the employer says, golly, you know, we've had a really rough week the last week, or golly, we want to change job duties and need some additional training support from you, then the employment support professional comes in and provides that additional assistance to keep that job stable. Next slide, please, Dina. So this is going back to Olmsted. I've already told you about this. Basically, it demands that states provide services in the most integrated setting. No state in the union is doing this well. And Colorado is not doing it very well at all. So next slide, please. Oh, we have our little judicial gavel that just bounced past us. The next slide is a picture of Clarence Miller. I bring this up because Clarence and I did presentations like I'm doing with you right now for many years to national audiences. Clarence was very effective in helping me with those presentations because he actually was employed in 3 different sheltered workshops. And the quote here from Clarence is, "I'm sick and tired of people trying to put me in sheltered workshops. Olmsted says people with disabilities have a right to work in the community. This is ridiculous." For those of you who know Clarence or knew Clarence, you know that he passed away in 2014. But Clarence, because of his experiences, knew how debilitating and harmful these segregated settings are to people, and fought valiantly against them during his lifetime. Next slide, please. So where are we at nationally? We've been doing this now for 30 years. We had great success in the initial 10 years from 86 to 96, as did Colorado. Colorado was tops in the nation back in the mid-90s. We were leading the nation in many ways as far as employing people with significant disabilities in regular community settings. The interesting thing is that there are wide differences among the states as to the percentage of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities being served by the state, and of that group, the percentage of those individuals who is actually being employed in the community. And so you have these vast differences where you have Alabama at 5%, you have Washington State at 84%. This is of all the people with IDD who are served in the state, 84% in Washington State are being served in a regular community job. Why the difference? Anybody? Why would we have that kind of difference between the states? Expectation, yeah, absolutely. Expectation would be a part of it. What else? Keeping in mind that we have state systems to try to assist people to become employed in the community, why would you have that kind of divergence among the states? Yeah, Carol says it might be because of the supported employment service that the state has put into place and that the local system provides. And in my mind, that's absolutely the right answer, is that this comes to state policy and the function of the state in providing adequate supports for people. Next slide, please. This slide is of the US growth and decline of supported employment. It shows that we've gone from 8% in 1988 up to a high of almost 25% as the century passed, and now nationally are down at about 20% of all people with IDD being served throughout the United States, being served in a community integrated employment setting. Next slide. This is a slide of some of how the individual states are basically performing at this point. Colorado comes in at 33% with the latest statistics from the Coleman Institute. I don't know how they made an 8% jump when I didn't notice it between 2013 and 2015, but that's what the data shows. But the thing to keep in mind is that only 9 to 10% of all people are in regular community employment. So what's the other part of this 33%? It's group employment. It's enclaves. It's recycling centers that have groups of people working. It's this group junk that is not considered, again, in the 80s was considered best practice, but is not considered best practice any longer. We know we don't need that when appropriate accommodations are provided through the implementation of customized employment. The real concern here, and this is why I put what's with the 8% jump in 1 year or 2 years, is data is necessary, and data is something we lack here in the state of Colorado and nationally. Each state collects our data a little differently. We don't really know what it says, so data is a real issue. Next slide, please. Here's the growth and decline of supported employment in Colorado. It shows that in 1996, we were at over 50% of all people served were being served in community integrated employment. That number dropped down into the low 20s and mid 20s. As you saw in the last slide, it's jumped up to 33% according to the data, but with all due respect, I don't believe the data in Colorado is accurate. Next slide, please. So the new standard, and this gets to best practice again, I was saying that this group junk, this sheltered workshops, these are not considered best practice. What is considered best practice has been codified within WIOA, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which was passed in 2014. We got regs a couple of years ago. It's basically employment, which is at a location where the employee interacts with other people who are not individuals with disabilities, not including supervisory personnel or individuals who are providing services to such employee, to the same extent that individuals who are not individuals with disabilities and who are in comparable positions interact with other persons. This is a technical definition. I put it in because this is the integration mandate that is consistent with Olmstead, that now is in the formal definition within law about what competitive integrated employment is. The formal definition within law about supported employment basically says that it's the achievement of competitive integrated employment within a community employment setting. And so all of these things are starting to mesh together and be consistent with Olmstead, be consistent with best practice, and basically tell us that the expectation is that people have the right to be in an employment setting where they interact with coworkers just the same way as anybody else. When I worked at IBM with a group of 4 people and we ran around IBM doing various duties. Those individuals had an opportunity to interact some with coworkers, but because they had the mother duck, me, and they were the 4 ducklings running around, and they all had people, they were all people with disabilities, there was a presumption made on the part of IBM employees that you must have to be a professional to interact with these poor folks, these disabled people. Having people in groups automatically closes them off for true interactive relationships and the building of relationships with those coworkers. And so we're finally moving past that and realizing that, again, consistent with Olmsted in '99, that people have a right to be integrated in the community in these employment situations. So this definition is consistent with the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act and is also consistent with Colorado's Employment First Bill, 16-077. Next slide, please. What kinds of state-funded services are not compliant according to the latest guidance from DOJ, the Department of Justice? Well, that would include sheltered workshops. Now, Colorado now calls this model pre-vocational services. So when you hear that mentioned, it's basically a shelter workshop. Group employment, enclaves or work crews are not consistent with the integration mandate. Groups of people going into the community during the day to go to the mall or to volunteer are also not compliant. Now, that's a reference to a service called Community Connections or Supported Community Connections that the Medicaid waivers provide here in the state of Colorado. Those services are great for developing relationships with people in the community if you're not in a group. Unfortunately, somewhere around 97-98% of all people served in the community in that way are served in groups. Every now and then there'll be a person served as an individual in a volunteer position in the community under supported community connections under the 2 adult Medicaid waivers, but it's very minimal when you actually have people compliant with Olmsted with these services. This means that 90% of people with IDD in Colorado are apparently being served in non-compliant programs. This is what should be worrying our public policymakers, because it sets us up similarly to Oregon and similarly to Rhode Island, sets us up for a lawsuit. Rhode Island achieved a settlement agreement with the Department of Justice in 2013. In 2014, Oregon reached a settlement agreement. In both cases, they provided the state with definitive guidelines on improving the amount of integrated employment each year over a 10-year period to get them in compliance with Olmsted over a period of time. Colorado shouldn't want to do this, but Colorado is moving in this direction by their lack of moving ahead. We're hoping that Senate Bill 77 will help in that area. Next slide, please. I like to show this slide. It's about what Self-Advocates Becoming Empowered has said about employment. I know Heidi is familiar with SABE. How many people are familiar with Self-Advocates Becoming Empowered? A number of you are. So that's good. Self-Advocates Becoming Empowered of the USA is a national group of self-advocates, and this is basically their policy. We also have, of course, self-advocacy groups here in Colorado. Colorado, speaking for ourselves, is the state entity, and many times the local ARC chapters are affiliated with a local SABE or People First or Speaking for Ourselves chapter. All those names basically refer to the self-advocacy movement. Anyway, SABE calls for equal employment opportunities with equal pay for all people. They call for no more people, no new people going into sheltered workshops. They call for no additional people going into enclaves. They call for an end of sub-minimum wages by 2012 and an end to enclaves in 2014. Well, this was published in 2009. These timelines and requests for change in the system have not occurred, as you might imagine. And so we continue to push forward. Next slide, please. This is Chester Finn. He's the former president of Self-Advocates Becoming Empowered. And what he said in his employment document published in 2010 was other groups fighting for their civil rights would not stand for separate places, neither should we. Chester happens to be African American. Next slide, please. The Department of Justice has begun getting very involved in these lawsuits, and so how much time do I have? Okay, good, thank you. So Eve Hill at the DOJ had a lot to do with, she's no longer with the DOJ, but she had a lot to do with the settlement agreement in Rhode Island. I've got a quote from her that says, "Unfortunately, the exploitation and tyranny of low expectations we found are an all too common result of the segregation of people with disabilities. That is why we at the Department of Justice will continue to work hard to fight this type of discrimination." So she was commenting on what they found in Rhode Island, which again, demographically is very similar to what we find here in Colorado. Next slide, please. So what are we doing to get compliant? Senate Bill 77, that's what we're doing. Employment First, this is called the Employment First Bill, or Employment First for persons with disabilities in Colorado. The definition of Employment First is a framework for change in the provision of services that is centered on the premise that all persons, including persons with the most significant disabilities, and so again, people with significant intellectual and developmental disabilities, people with very significant physical disabilities, people with mental health issues, people with significant brain injury, that all people are capable of full participation in the community and in competitive integrated employment. This is the promise, again, of Olmsted. But in this case, it's framed within the definition of Employment First. Employment First in the general workforce is the first and preferred outcome for all working age persons with disabilities, regardless of level of disability. So again, this emphasis on the fact that we now know how to employ people with the appropriate accommodations and that customization I've mentioned earlier. All people can work, and it doesn't matter what a person's level of disability is. Next slide, please. So Employment First is being implemented by what's called the EFAP, the Employment First Advisory Partnership. I currently serve as co-chair of that group. We basically were created last January. We need to get a report into the General Assembly within the legislation. It says between November 1st and the beginning of the 2018 session. We submitted that report to our departmental partners, which includes HCPF, Department of Healthcare Policy and Financing, the Colorado Department of Education, the Colorado Department of Higher Education, the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment, and the Colorado Department of Human Services. Those 5 departments are our agency partners in this effort to implement Employment First within Colorado. So I've got a list of the different stakeholders, but as you might imagine, people with disabilities, family members, advocates, as well as these departmental folks are all required to be on the EFAP. Next slide, please. So I've got some quotes from the actual legislation to give you a feel for what the mandate is here. It's basically to assure that competitive integrated employment is the primary objective and preferred outcome for all working age adults with disabilities. This is consistent with the Employment First definition. It's also to identify barriers to employment for people with disabilities in the state of Colorado. Next slide. It's to identify training and knowledge gaps within Colorado. And so this gets to that idea that I mentioned earlier about people with disabilities, families, and service providers don't know what in the hell they're doing, excuse the vernacular, but they don't understand how to provide evidence-based best practice because they haven't gotten the training. So training and knowledge gaps identification is important. Data and the gaps in data is important, and in particularly as it relates to Olmsted compliance. Next slide, please. We should be making recommendations related to pre-vocational services. As you may recall, pre-vocational services is basically congregate work, large groups of people doing stuff together. This was best practice in 1950, folks. It was. When the ARC movement pushed this in this direction, when the agency I used to run was created in 58, it was best practice. It ain't no more. So making recommendations relating to how to shift pre-vocation out of pre-vocational services and move toward employment. And then looking at career development, planning, and the discovery process. The discovery process is a reference to an assessment process that, instead of focusing on a person's potential, whether they have the potential to be employed, we know that's not important because we know everybody has the potential to be employed. It's a focus on qualitatively getting to know the person, what their preferences are, speaking with family members, speaking with friends, community members, teachers, to try to better understand the person and what their likes and dislikes are and how they might fit into an employment situation. Next slide, please. So we have submitted this draft. It is not public yet. We've had some glitches in making it look pretty, and we want to make it look pretty before we move ahead. But with the public process, but it has completed clearance with those 5 agencies I mentioned earlier. It's on target for submission to the Colorado General Assembly before the session begins January 10th. And the law requires that we continue to meet and revise that on an annual basis up to 2021. So the EFAP will be reforming here in February or March, and then we'll probably be doing quarterly meetings throughout the next year, 2018. Next slide, please. So initial EFAP recommendations include the implementation of a communication plan. This is to get information out about what people's potential is. And the focus of this are educators, employers, people with disabilities, and families, to try to bring back some of the common understanding we had 2 decades ago that people with disabilities can work, can be productive, can provide employers with productive capacity that pays off for them. And I'm sorry, nobody's asked questions, but just to remind you as I rip through this stuff, please stop me if you have any questions on any of this. Next slide, please. We're basically recommending that we get better data, that Colorado start to produce better data, particularly in the home and community-based services waivers that serve people with IDD. So that's HCBS, SLS, which is supported living services, and HCBS DD, which is the comprehensive or the developmental disabilities waiver. Now, of course, those 2 waivers are in the process of being combined, but that's where our focus is, because that's where people are being needlessly segregated in segregated day programs, segregated pre-vocational, congregate groups of people going out and working, and congregate groups of people going out to access their community. You can only go to Buffalo Bill's grave so many times and not become completely bored with it. Implement a department-wide employment first policy and practice scenario. And so we're trying to have the departments continue to analyze how they can modify their rules and regs and practices to be consistent with employment first. Next slide. To create an office of employment first. Now, this is a toughie. It would cost money, and so as we look to this next session, we are concerned that this may not fly. But part of this is trying to get some coordination between the various departments in doing their work, particularly between CDLE, which is the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment, which is where the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation resides, and HCBUF, which is where the Division for Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities used to reside. Now it's still there somewhere. We just can't point a finger at it. So getting those 2 departments in particular, labor and the state Medicaid agency, to better coordinate is one of those primary focuses of that recommendation. A training plan for state service providers on evidence-based practice is another thing that we feel is very, very important. Back in the 90s, we had a statewide agency, and for those of you who are as old or almost as old as I, you might remember Rocky Mountain Resource and Training Institute. That was a multi-state agency funded entity that trained providers as well as families and people with disabilities about the promise of supported employment. And they did a bang-up job of getting that information out to the public and out to service providers back in the day. That again was in the 90s. Next, please. Pilot projects is another thing that we are recommending. Again, this costs big bucks, and so we aren't focused on this as we move into this session. Finally, becoming a model, or not finally, but next to the last, becoming a model employer for Colorado citizens with disabilities. This refers to the state stepping up to the plate and looking at barriers that the state has to hiring people with disabilities for state government. You know, I was around for 30 years before the state hired me, so I mean, I know that they can modify their policies and procedures to hire people with significant disabilities. Where there's a technical issue with this one in that we have been trying to find out what happened to Senate Bill 08004. Again, for those of you who are more mature, you may recall that in 2007, the General Assembly had an interim committee that focused on people with IDD. That interim committee studied the current system, and then in 2008, a number of bills were put out. The Family Caregiver Bill was one of those bills, an effort to try to improve employment services for people through DVR was one of those bills. One of those bills was that the state should hire people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And we can't find any evidence that the work was done on that. So if any of you who are more mature have any insight into that, I would appreciate it. I've been working with the Department of Human Services and the Department of Personnel Administration, which were the two entities within that legislation that were supposed to study how to basically get rid of the barriers to state employment of people with disabilities. And we're just having a devil of a time getting the detail on that. Next slide.
Bob, can I interrupt just
Please.
to ask a question for
Absolutely.
Paula
Yes.
online? Is there any data that looks at how well each county does with providing community employment? I would see this be successful in smaller rural areas where there is already high unemployment rates.
That's a great question. That's exactly what I would like to see. You can go online, and if you are really great at Google searching, you can find statistics between the year of 2005 and 2010 for the state of Colorado that break out these data by community-centered board. So community-centered boards are sometimes county-based, but sometimes multi-county-based organizations that serve people with IDD. And up until 2010, the state was collecting data on number of people employed in individual employment, number of people employed in group employment, number of people in these sheltered workshops, number of people in segregated day programs. All of this data was being gathered, hours per week employed, wages per hour. All of this data was being collected for each community represented by the community centered board. So in the rural areas, that's multi-county. Here in Denver, Boulder, Adams, Arapahoe Douglas is a single CCB, Jefferson County, plus Gilpin and Summit. But anyway, multi-county or single county entities that that were tracking this data. And again, this is part of the problem, is not only do we not have good state composite data, we don't have good local data, which is key to better understanding what the barriers are and to better understand what communities are doing a great job at this and which communities need some help that they might get from those communities are more successful. So that kind of data is really important, and we're hoping that we can go back to gathering that kind of data over time. Any other questions online? Okay, thank you. Develop appropriate funding structures that will increase employment service and support capacity. This is really key to making sure that we can get this done. There's a crisis currently in the IDD system, and some would say in many of the Medicaid funded services throughout the state, where because of our rising home prices and because of our stagnant wages and because of our a very low unemployment rate, we are having a very difficult time in retaining qualified support professionals to support people who are funded through Medicaid programs. This is particularly concerning in the IDD world, where some agencies are reporting annual turnover rates as high as 80%. The average in the state is closer to 40%. 40% of the staff turnover each year as a result of the low funding of those positions. And so that's a real bottom line that we need to focus on. I want to stop and just ask for people on the phone or anybody in the audience if there are additional questions. Carol.
Thanks, Bob. So I work for the ARC, and we don't, collect data. So this is anecdotal responses. But what I'm hearing from some folks who are dually eligible for the DD system and the mental health system is that they prefer the supported employment services they're getting through the mental health system versus the DD waiver system. And I think that probably those supported employment services that are provided under the managed care contract that the BHOs currently manage that are going into the raise. But I wonder if this group has taken a look at any of their practices to see if those can be incorporated into I just looked at the waiver chart, and only the DD waivers provide supported employment services. There isn't another adult waiver that provides supported employment services. Yeah, and it seems to be under that managed care contract. I mean, I cannot track how mental health is funded any day of the week, but I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, no, it's a real good point. And yes, we had Stacy Teagarden, who is with the Office of Behavioral Health with the Department of Human Services on the EFAP, and we talked a lot about what's referred to as IPS, which stands for Individual Placement and Support. That is the current model that the mental health organizations around the state are using. Not all of them, but many of them are using that. Stacy is tasked with providing technical assistance and training to be basically to provide staff with the information they need in order to implement that. IPS, or Individual Placement and Support, is basically just good supported employment. There's not much that's new there, but what is very positive about that effort is that Stacy goes around and analyzes whether people are doing it on a best practice basis or not. And so that part of the model, which allows for agencies to get the technical assistance they need in order to implement supported employment well, is something that's completely missing from the DD system. And so, yeah, you can Google individual placement and support, and you'll see these basic requirements in order to be compliant with the model. And the really neat thing is, as I say, is that the way it's being implemented in Colorado right now is you've got the technical assistance you need to understand how to do it well. And then Stacy comes out 6 months later and looks at it again, and looks at your statistics, looks at how much time it's taking between the time the person is referred and they get their first job interview, the time between their first job interview and actually being hired. These are all important statistics to keep that no one is keeping in the IDD system. Many of us used to keep it back in the 90s, but we've lost all track of best practice, evidence-based practice, and data that should go along with it to evaluate whether you're implementing it correctly. So it's a very, very exciting development in behavioral health organizations around the state. And yes, we are looking at that as a potential model DVR, the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation, is quite interested in looking at expanding that template for IPS across other disability groups that need supported employment. So again, that would be people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and people with brain injury. So yeah, I appreciate you bringing it up. Other questions or follow-up? Seeing none, we'll wrap up here. There are three essentials here, in my opinion, for systems change in this area. One is a clear employment first policy and commitment by the executive branch to implement it. We are working on that right now through this employment first process. The second, we just talked about, adequate technical assistance and training to assure best practice services and supports, and to provide an understanding by all stakeholders that all people with disabilities have employment potential. So the training and technical assistance is more technical when you come to what agencies need and what employment support professionals need, and less technical perhaps for people with disabilities and families, and educators, but the need is just as great. Critical need that those, other entities understand this as well. And then finally, effective rate structures. Without providing adequate rates for these services, we will never be able to implement them. And so that's extremely important. Next slide, please. You skipped one. I don't want people to have to yell yet. Thank you. So what are we waiting for? Families and self-advocates may not be aware of their rights under Olmstead and may not understand real employment and the opportunity it provides to their sons and daughters. Same thing, of course, goes for people with disabilities. Colorado's Community Center Board system staff have not been trained in best practice. The state has traditionally not been willing to pay adequate rates for these employment outcomes. Employers seem very willing to embrace a diverse workforce. We must maintain high expectations for all people with significant disabilities when it comes to employment, and we must join together to meet segregation head on. Next slide. Because we have to let people know, what do we want? When do we want it? What do we want? When do we want it? What do we want? When do we want it? Thank you very much. A couple of questions?
So, as you were talking, I was thinking, I mean, yes, if the state comes up with some way of providing jobs, but don't we really need to make an impact on the private sector? And are there records of strategies working in that regard, going to Chamber of Commerce, going to the various service groups that have lots of employers
connections to employers? Sure. Yeah, it's a very good question, but it's a chicken or egg question for me, in that when I present it in front of employers and get them jazzed about this, and they maybe chant as we just did, and they say, where do I sign up? And I say to them, well, I'm sorry, we don't have any agencies that know how to do this in Colorado. If you have any divisions in Oklahoma or in Washington State or in Illinois, I can tell you where to go, but I couldn't tell you here. So this is why these kinds of things have to happen at the same time. You've got to build the infrastructure back in here in Colorado so that we can respond to employer requests to do these things. But specific to the questions of employers, one of the recommendations that we're making to the legislature relates to the Business Leadership Network. This is a group that we had in Colorado, again, 2 decades ago. We tried to get it back up and running about 5 years ago, and we're not successful. But it is a part of what I believe will be proposed as legislation in this session, where we get employers together who believe in this and who understand that their workforce is enhanced through diversity, and specifically through the diversity that people with disabilities bring, and get those employers. For instance, Wells Fargo, again, is a national U.S. Business Leadership Network participant and is quite active throughout the states in promoting the employment of people with disabilities. They're a target for us here in Colorado to get them involved. There are a variety of other national corporations that have interest in this. And of course, we need to get smaller employers or more medium-sized employers and family businesses involved in this as well. But basically the BLN concept is a matter of those businesses meet on, say, a monthly basis. They talk about some of their common understanding of the issues and concerns and experiences that they've had, and then share that information with each other with the purpose of trying to expand employment opportunities for people with disabilities. So that is an item that we plan to propose in legislation during this next session. So thank you for that question. It's a good one. My pleasure, always a pleasure.
And we'll take a break till 10:45. People are getting the multiple emails a day about what to do about the tax bill. Carol, what source do you think is best in terms of that action, or are they all pretty similar? Okay. Colorado Center on Law and Policy is a place to go for recommendations about what to do. Voices. Organizations, because they've got more power to really pull the information together. Uh-huh. Disability Advocacy Network. So, okay. Okay. Great. Okay. Well, before I introduce Heidi again, and she gets to introduce a key presenter after we see his film, Adam Tucker would have been here today, but this time is a busy time for all the state agencies in terms of beginning to gear up for the legislative session. So Adam would appreciate hearing from any clinician. So if you, a clinician yourself, or if you know of people, especially those not tied to a particular mental health center, who would be willing to see persons with IDD and mental health behavioral concerns, he would really appreciate knowing of those folks, because the Healthcare Policy and Finance hopes in the next months to begin to do some outreach to identifying clinicians. And so the other slide. So Adam gave me just a brief update. You know, most of these sessions we have a little bit more information on the crisis pilot, but this happened to hit at a really busy time for them. So for those who aren't familiar, the crisis pilot, the cross systems crisis response pilots, forgetting what the R is, exist over on the Western Slope, Mesa County, and in Larimer County, and have been in operation for about 16 months now in terms of providing the services that were proposed under the pilot. They've certainly been reporting success, but that has a fairly limited reach. And so, but they continue under the legislation that was passed for the crisis systems work, conducting another round of independent program evaluations, and looking at gathering best practices as well as limitations and lessons learned. They have been using, having Joni Beasley from
from the START program, providing supports and training, and they hope to expand that. But they're constantly focusing on reinforcing and developing innovative ways to use a person-centered approach and trauma-informed care in addressing crisis events. The partners are working diligently, so that includes Rocky Mountain Health Plan, which is the oversight, and then the community center boards, the mental health system, as well as other community providers are all coming together to provide the supports and follow-up plans that are based on the individual's acuity of need. This approach encourages earlier interventions, supports being provided in the environments that mitigate the need for transitions, and a continuum of care that embodies the recovery model. So that's the update from Adam as to what's happening. They expect to deliver a legislative report, probably not until July 1, 2018, which will have the recommendations going forward. So now I'd like to turn the podium back again to Heidi Haynes. Those of you who were here earlier heard her give us an update on plans for the legislative session. One of Heidi's other roles is that she really is the program coordinator for a nationally funded grant supporting self-advocates becoming employed. And so she has a little bit of an update of work to tell us about in that regard. The group that she's been meeting with, is it 2 years now? Right. And then the bulk of the time we're going to give to her introducing a film made by Andy Kotlowski that was shown at the film festival, the ARC Film Festival. Was it just last year? Yeah. Yeah. And then we're going to have opportunities to ask Andy questions.
Thanks, Corey.
Sure.
Okay, so yeah.
Leaving it behind. Thank you.
All right, so this is the fun stuff. So what Corey was talking about is this SARTEC, which is a grant that is a 5-year grant that was given to self-advocates becoming empowered, which you heard Bob talk about a little bit before. That's the National Self-Advocacy Group. I'm an advisor for that group. So SABE got the grant, and it stands for Self-Advocacy Resource and Technical Assistance Center. In the past, they still gave money to self-advocacy groups to kind of provide technical assistance around the country, but it was kind of clustered. So, and people didn't really even know that that was available unless maybe you were in that state. I know for Colorado, our group was located in Arizona, and we worked with them on a different group, but before we started working with them on that other grant, I had no idea that they were even a resource that would be available to self-advocates here in Colorado. So what this grant does is basically takes all of those resources and all of that funding and makes it live in an online home. So that's this website here, which is selfadvocacyinfo.org. That, if you go to that website, you will find all sorts of resources. They have they're working with some of the partners like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. They have some wonderful resources. They have a self-advocate's guide to Medicaid, that autistic, that ASAN created, that is amazing. So I would definitely recommend going there. It also provides all sorts of information about contacting legislators, things that are important, and opportunities are all posted there. It's a great resource. And they've had a committee of 12 self-advocates that have worked under fellowships for the past year and have been kind of prioritizing and developing content for the self-advocacy resource technical assistance center online. And we just recently got an announcement, we can go to the next slide, that they just opened up the 2018-2019 fellowships are open. So If you know, or if you are a self-advocate that is interested in applying for that, you can go to the website here. There's a link here, but if you go to that selfadvocacyinfo.org website, you will see this picture that's right here. And then you would be prompted to go to apply, and basically you get some funding in order to do that, and you get to take a trip and meet with the other committee members. It's a really neat opportunity, and I'm glad that we're able to let you guys all know about it right now before the deadline closes. It hasn't happened yet. I think it closes in about 2 weeks. So if you're interested, you probably want to do that. And if you want any help doing an application or anything, feel free to contact me. I'd be happy to help anybody with that. All right, sounds good. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. I also wanted to let everybody know that Self Advocates Becoming Empowered is having their national conference June 7th through the 9th in Birmingham, Alabama. Information about that can be found at saveconference.org. We're really excited because we weren't able to do a convention in 2016, mainly because there were no cities that provided, no self-advocacy groups or regions provided a bid that was going to work to have the conference. That's a really big undertaking, and it's expensive and timely, and it's just a lot to take on, and nobody was able to do it. But I'm able to share this with you. Shay Tanis from the Coleman Institute, who has the Coleman Conference every year here in Colorado, has reached out, and she actually came and met with a statewide group here in Colorado, and she's interested in actually potentially moving where they do the Coleman Conference to Denver and trying to do the Coleman Conference in conjunction with the 2020 SAVE Conference, which would be amazing. So she came and talked to the group, and we are in the process of getting a bid packet together. So stay tuned, because we're excited. Our group is all gung-ho, but like I said, it's a lot of it's a lot of work. So we want to make sure that we have a robust commitment from folks, so that we can get that through. So it's very exciting. Okay, next. I wanted to let you know you can go to this website too, on the saveusa.org website. There's constantly, well, not constantly, but there's newsletters that come available, and this is pages long, and it's all sorts of information about SAVE and what they're doing around the country. Next slide. And we've been busy. That's Tia Nellis. She is the president of SAVE right now. You can see she's there with former Senator Tom Harkin, doing her thing. And I have another one that was on the Medicaid, and here she is with doing tax breaks. So if you're interested in that, and you want to know what's happening on a national level with self-advocates kind of working around national policy, I would highly recommend liking Save USA on Facebook. And that's basically my spiel right now. If anybody has questions, feel free to email or call me. But we're going to show a film called Lonely Highway that Andy Kowalewski created, and that we did show at the film festival this year. And then he will be available afterwards to answer any questions you all might have. So thank you very much. If you can think of any films that should be considered for that this year, just let me know. So here's Andy.
How's it going? Oh, totally, yeah. I actually had a class today, and I begged my film teacher, which I have a film class, and I told him about this opportunity, and I said I really want to do it, and I hate to leave your class with damaging my grade a little bit. So he said, fine, go ahead. This sounds like a pretty cool opportunity. But it will not affect your grade, and that's what I wanted to hear. So thanks. So because of that, I was able to make it. So thanks to him, I'm thankful to be here today. Mm-hmm. Thank you. You're welcome.
So you're in college now, right?
Yes.
And what are you majoring in?
Digital filmmaking within the communications department.
Great. How's it going there?
It's fine. I've already been through a year of college. I'm a sophomore now, and Should I do? Would you like me to talk about my roommate on which I explain there or not?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Um, I tell us a lot. The guy who I explained in Lonely Highway, he left me for a single, and then UCCS gave me a guy fresh off the boat. I hated that guy so. Oh, he okay, so he was he's from Colorado too, but he was a gamer and he was a slacker. He would not clean up his room, and I had morning classes, he had afternoon classes. I told my parents, I can't stand this pain. This guy is not working out with me, so so I begged him, come on, get me out of here, give me a single, and that was better. And I stayed in the oldest dorm on my campus called Steamboat, and from there, it got better. But then I told him this semester I want to try the commuter life to see how I like it, see how it goes, and I like it of the driving experience because I think that's where I calm down. I think about what am I doing today and so on and so forth. Yeah.
So, as somebody who is an ASPE and a fellow former UCCS student,
Oh, really?
yeah,
Wow.
I wonder what you have felt the best accommodations have been in your classes, and how you've interacted with instructors, and how receptive they've been. I've had some really miserable experiences. I've been in and out of UCCS, UC Denver, Rappel Community College, and Community College of Aurora, all because the STEM programs, unfortunately, these instructors don't tend to be all that open to students on the spectrum, and they're not very inclusive. So I'm wondering how your instructors are in the film program. It's entirely different. The communications department is different than any the science and math programs. So I'm just wondering, what your experiences have been.
So I would say they're very, very engaging with a person who has a disability. Like what all you have to do is give them their yes, exactly, just like that. And then they go through the lowdown and say, how can I help? How can I help? You tell me what you need help with. And that's what they do. They respect, just like what some other universities do. So basically like the same thing like that. Now, I have accommodations for taking a test in a separate building, because if I take it in the classroom, I get stressed if I see somebody finish before me. Exactly, just like that. So I think they're very respectful and just like the rest of the staff on campus, because every single teacher I've had, and I gave them my accommodation form, all of them have done the same thing of saying, how can I help and what resources can I provide you for that help. So yeah, so very nice staff there.
Especially since we're I'm an ASPE, I'm an ASPE, and so it's interesting to talk to another person, because not many people are tend to be open with this information. Have you found you said you found your roommate situation has been kind of challenging. Have you found some of the social situations you have to engage with, cleaning? Because I was at UCCS as well, and there not only is there you have a dorm mate, but then you have suite mates. Did you find it challenging of figuring out traditional responsibilities, shared bathroom garbage, or cleaning the bathroom, cleaning the shower, those general community maintenance tasks? Did you find that challenging as well to kind of schedule out, or were you kind of all working, or were you all working together and just basically creating a schedule or doing those tasks ad hoc as needed?
So scheduling with cleaning this with the roommate I had, it was it was hard because I'm the type of person, if I see a mess, I clean it up. Because if that thing sits for the rest of the day, I'm like, I'm gonna go crazy. And I come from a clean environment, but I don't think he did. So so I think of it as like, you got to clean every single week. You can't wait 2 weeks and clean up the mess. Because I felt like I was the one doing most of the cleaning, and he just came back and he thought of the dorm place as his fun house, and not focusing. That's right. Yeah, he likes freedom instead of work presented to him. So he was one of those type of persons that I did not get along with, because of his, just like what I explained before, because he was not he thinks cleaning is like a normal thing and not like a mandatory thing he must do.
You can stand here. Yeah, since I'm going to be asking you to take questions.
Uh-huh.
Did you get any transitional support between high school and college, or were you just kind of saying, I'm going to go to this school and what happens? Did the coordinators in the disability accessibility office, did they have their poop in a group?
So to answer your question, I would say the transition from high school to college, I took a program called Avid, and these guys help you, like they practice you to take the ACT. You take an assignment to look up colleges on where you want to go, what do they require, if this is a school you want to go to, and you also practice writing a resume. So it's a class getting you into the adult world. And I think that class really helped out with college.
That was at your high school?
Yes. In my high school pre-college years. And to talk about the transition from I think it's a 401k from high school.
401k is a plan for retirement.
Oh, retirement. Sorry about that.
It's going to be either an IEP or a 501.
That's what it is. That's what it is. Yeah. I'm so sorry about
right?
that. IEP. That's what I had in high school.
504.
And of course they said, when you graduate, that thing does not exist anymore. Exactly.
Which, unfortunately, from my experience, isn't enforced in college. Unfortunately, the disability services director have no personnel control, so they can't enforce the policy. So if an instructor doesn't want to follow it, they don't necessarily have to. So that has generally been my experience at the school. So it is wonderful that your high school was able to provide some accommodation, transitional support for you. So I think that's fantastic. I'm wondering if are you going to be able to go to a community center board and find similar transition when you get an apartment? Or do you have an apartment now? Did you find a community center board to provide those accommodations?
For living wise?
For living, yeah, community living situation.
So for right now, I don't have my own apartment. I'm living in the basement of my parents' house, and yeah, that's where I am for now, because that's where I feel like it's a safe environment. And the one thing I missed when I was in the dorm was, I'm so used to coming back to a house and everybody's talking, because that's what I grew up with. We all come home and talk about work, have dinner together. I missed that connection when I went to go live in the dorms, and I felt so lonesome of that living habit. I said, that's why I chose the commuter life, because I missed that talking constantly when you came home.
So you ultimately do want roommates and that ability to not only live independently, but with a collection of other people to kind of all pitch in the community environment.
Yeah, I think, if I have that, I can start learning to get along with somebody better and stuff like that. It's okay. It's fine.
So you made the film when you were in high school?
When I graduated from high school.
And how did you learn about that opportunity?
So parent-teacher conferences of 2015. I begged my dad to go see my film teacher in high school because he was such a cool person. He told jokes all the time, and his class was electronic media, and this was a news broadcast class, which was so he created a news program called KRAM, and that's a news program just telling about stories that's going on within my high school. And so I begged my dad to go see him at parent teacher conferences, and one question he asked him was, how can I further my son's love of film? And he sat back and thought for a long time, and then he said, and then he mentioned the Youth Documentary Academy, and he said, I sent another kid of mine there because so she can get better experience. And he thought if he does the same with me, I would get more experience as well. Yeah. Hmm.
What are your plans for life after college?
Um, I have not planned that far ahead yet, but let me give you a little more information on what I have so far for right now. So so of course I've set my degree of digital filmmaking within the communications department at UCCS. But the more and more I go on, I'm thinking it's gonna be a little tough to find a job when you have a film degree. Um, so so I told my parents I'm thinking about changing my major with putting film in my minor and majoring in something else because that was my film teacher from high school's recommendation. You go major in something else and minor in film, even though you love it so much. Um, so I thought about maybe majoring in a science degree of chemistry because um, it's a language I can speak and understand, and and I have a 91 in my chem lab.
Um, my question is so I'm a mental health provider working with kids with autism right now,
Mhm.
and I would love to know if this is kind of out there for public viewing, simply because I think about a lot of my young adults and teenagers I'm working with and how
Mhm.
incredibly inspirational I think your story could be for them.
Uh-huh.
And so that's my question. Are people able to access this and see this?
So this is where I will need a support from the organization and all that. So people think I own the film, but but YDA owns the film. So yeah. So we could talk afterwards about that, about the film to go from there. Yeah.
There's a guy um, that we met, oh gosh, about 7 or 8 years ago, and he last year graduated from Oberlin College with a degree with two majors, like
Oh.
you had been advised to do.
Mhm.
His first major is creative writing,
Hmm.
and then his second major is anthropology.
Hmm.
And so that's a cool combination, isn't it?
Oh, totally.
Michael, can we do that later? He's got stories to tell me about things he wants to do. But he got connected with a filmmaker when he
Mhm.
was in high school, and so he wrote what he wanted the film to be like
Mhm.
and totally had creative control over the film. But then the filmmaker did the shooting and they worked with other people on the editing, and he just got his film released and they've taken it around to small film festivals and he's won
Uh-huh.
awards
Oh, wow.
everywhere he went. and you will like his subheading. So the title of the movie is DEEJ, which is his nickname, Deej. But the subheading is inclusion. Inclusion shouldn't be a lottery.
I like that. I like that.
And so if anybody wanted to look at the trailer or consider available for free at a website where you can watch it for about 6 weeks. That ended on November 18th. But it DEEJmovie.com. And cool guy, friend of ours, that his dad was on a national board with me for many years. And like Mike, he types to tell his stories.
Incorporate the information.
Mhm.
These get posted. I'm
Photo.
afraid I need to switch gears. I just want to acknowledge Andy's grandparents there. Okay, so now we'll hear from Megan Cluth from Easter Seals, who has been managing the Colorado Respite program. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm a little nervous to follow that, I'm not gonna lie. I'll try to be as engaging. Oh, you're good. Perfect, okay. So my name is Megan Cluth. I work for Easter Seals Colorado and the Colorado Respite Coalition. I've presented a few times, but I'm just going to give you kind of an update of what we've been up to, what we're planning for 2018, and definitely, let you know some exciting things that are going on. Do I just tell you next, or do I? Okay. So the Colorado Respite Care Program, which we manage, is made up of Easter Seals Colorado, the Colorado Respite Coalition, which several of you guys know, Janice Tabaka and Val Size, who started it. It's been almost 10 years now. And we also work really closely with the State Department of Human Services. So just so you kind of know. Good. It began in 2011, so it's hard to believe, but we're in our 7th year. And we do serve all ages, all types of disabilities, and the whole state. So we do, everything from chronic disease to autism to mental health to Alzheimer's. The program has grown a lot. When I first started about 5 years ago, we had 1 full-time staff and a budget of less than 100,000. We now have 3 full-time staff and a much more manageable budget. So it's really exciting. I think there's clearly a need for respite services in Colorado, and I think we're slowly but surely making some progress with that. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about kind of the different areas that we're doing, but people always ask about our funding. So like I said, most of our partnerships are with the state. We try to be very collaborative with them and work alongside some of the efforts that they're doing. So mostly Department of Human Services, but we certainly interact with HCPF as well. So we are primarily funded through a federal grant. There's federal grants all over the country. About 30 other states have participated in programs like this. And we also get some state general funds due to some legislative advocates we've been able to befriend over the years. And then there's also the Respite Care Task Force, which I'll explain in a little bit. Okay, so the main areas that we kind of work on across our funding streams are, we do manage the Colorado Respite Coalition website. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the improvements that have been made to that, because it's definitely something people have been wanting for a long time, and I'm excited to say they're actually happening. We have our online respite locator, which now has almost 600 providers, so it's grown quite a bit. So anybody that's looking for respite services, it's free. You just go on our website, put in your zip code. You can do a keyword search now, and it will just bring up providers in your area. It's certainly not the end all be all, but it's it's the most comprehensive database that we know of for respite resources, and we're always adding more. We also do grants for actual providers. So we try to do as much direct service as possible. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the grants for this year later, but the demand is so high. We have about $270,000 we give out for direct service a year, and we got requests for over $570,000 this year. So there's clearly a need for enhancing respite services, and our grants are really designed to hit people that are underserved or unserved. So we certainly try to hit families that may be on a wait list or have already maxed out their respite funds through their waivers, or don't have access to any formal sources. So the good news is there's help. The bad news is there's not nearly enough, which is one thing we're trying to work on. We also have a voucher program. We've had that for about 2 years. It is unbelievable how fast that money is flying out the door, which is, again, it's always kind of the good and the bad of showing the need. But I'll talk a little bit more about that voucher program. But if you do have families that are really struggling with the financial side of respite, it's a great place to refer. So all of our information's on the website, and I have my contact information at the end. I'd be happy to share application forms and all of that. Just so you know, nothing we do is income-based. We ask for demographics, but that's a common assumption. But we don't turn people away because of their income. We also do a lot of trainings. One thing we're really excited about in 2018 is we're actually starting a partnership with JFK and doing a 5-part webinar series around trainings for managing people with higher behavioral needs. We've definitely identified for many years that that's a gap and decided if there's not going to be enough trainings, we're going to do them ourselves. So Dina and I and Kristen Kaiser have been working on that. I think we'll be getting announcements out once we kind of finalize dates and everything. But the way we're doing it is it'll be spread throughout the calendar year of 2018. There will be a session on working with children and the different behavioral needs that they may have. And it's going to be pretty 101 level is kind of the hope, or maybe 201 at the highest. Then we'll do kind of a transitional young adult age, an adult, and then older adults. And then we're going to do one session around cultural considerations around managing behaviors. So we're really excited about that. I think it's something we've talked about for a long time. So I think JFK has been a great partner, and we're really excited to expand that. We also just do a lot of this, honestly, just talking to people and talking about why respite's important. I think it's really exciting, and in my time here, I've never seen this many people talking about respite, and it's encouraging. There's a long way to go, but I think, you know, there's a lot of people that are talking about it and having the right, getting the right people at the table, and that might be the hardest part. So it's encouraging and it's exciting to see where we may go. And then our core is just working with families. We're kind of the middleman between families and providers. So just doing referrals, helping people connect. So, you know, respite's our key thing, but we get calls all the time for non-respite related things. I think very few caregivers only need respite. So, you know, send people to us if they need any type of caregiver resource. Okay, so here's our website. Many of you may be familiar with it. You go next. Oh no, isn't that picture cute? Okay, so I'm excited to say things have been happening with the website. It's now mobile responsive, so it's really easy to use on your phone or your tablet. It's like very 2017 to do that. We've started translating more things into Spanish. At some point, we'd like to explore more languages, but that's clearly the biggest need. And we now have pretty much all of our materials for families are in Spanish. We don't have somebody fluent on staff, but we can typically hobble by. But that's definitely something that's been being talked about. So one thing people had not liked about our website, and we certainly understood this, was it was harder to separate by age group. I mean, because we're lifespan, it's tough for us to do that. So we added a keyword search. So now anywhere on our website, including the locator, you can type in autism. You can type in specific keywords and it will pull up any resource related to that need. So it's not perfect, but the hope is that that helps narrow things down a little bit. We're also, next year, we're going to be, we're developing this other database that I'll talk about, and we're going to kind of model the respite locator after that. But the idea is to make more filters so that it's really easy and quick for people to narrow down what might be a good fit. So you can just filter out in-home care, you can filter out, you know, my provider needs to speak this language, that type of thing. But I mean, as with all of our efforts, I think we especially rely on you guys for the website. So if you hear feedback, please share it. We know it's not perfect. It's kind of this constantly evolving thing, but a lot of our changes have come out of meetings like this. So please feel free to share feedback. Okay, so here's the new stuff we're doing. So we have a new federal grant. So we're funded with that piece through 2020, which is really exciting. We're one of very few states that have been able to continue funding like this. So we're growing our voucher program. That being said, the money is literally flying out the door. So we take applications on a rolling basis. You can always have families apply to us. Typically they get $500 to $1,000 depending on what funding cycle we're on. But usually that equates to about 50 hours on average per family of respite. So it's not the long-term solution, but it's a really great way for people to fill in the gaps, or if they've never been able to try respite, it's a really great time for them to kind of test a few things. They can use multiple providers and just see what the right fit is, and then we can work with them on kind of what happens next. Eastern Seals has done a model called Coming Up for Air for the past few years. It's held up at our camp, which is in Empire, about an hour into the mountains from here. It's right off I-70. And the model is, it's like a Friday night through a Sunday morning thing. The whole family comes up to our camp, their lodging, food, all of that is included. It's traditionally been done for families with children and teens with special needs, any type of special need. So we're doing another session in February for that. I'm happy to send brochures. It's really cheap for the families, and we have scholarships. I think this year it's like $50 for the family for the whole weekend, and that includes, if anybody can come up with a $50 weekend vacation for their family, let me know. But it's cool because like the kids, including siblings, get to just be kids and play with our counselors, and their activities I'm always a little jealous of. Like that we have, all sorts of outdoor activities, and there's always a fun theme, and our counselors are just like big kids, so they get to play. And then the parents and guardians get to kind of work with each other, kind of build their own support with each other. And then we do training. So we do one session about navigating community resources, and we ask families what's worked well for you and kind of let them share. Betty Lehman does a presentation for us about financial planning for these families. And then the afternoon sessions are really focused on just kind of the emotional aspects of caregiving. And I think for a lot of these parents, it's the first time they get to really unwind a little bit and just let go. And it's always an emotional weekend, but it's such a cool experience. So we'll be doing our traditional model with children's and teens with special needs. Again, siblings are welcome to come in February. And then in March for the third year, we're doing a session specifically on kinship, adoptive, and foster families. So that's a population that's kind of grown near and dear to our hearts. So I'm really excited to do that one again. Other things we're doing in the next couple of years, so obviously we're based in Denver, but we do have volunteer-led groups in Northern Colorado, Southern, Denver Metro, Western Slope, Summit County, and most recently the Durango area. And we're trying to expand that even further. So the goal for 2018 is we're going to venture out to Eastern Colorado. And the goal for that is really, we don't know what works in their area, and we want to provide the resources we can so that people that actually live in that community can develop what they think they need for respite. So it's been a fun opportunity to get to know each region, and we're looking forward to expanding those more. Okay. So one other thing that I'm particularly excited about is this was occurring, but it kind of naturally followed the work that Dr. Moody was doing, and we recently did a presentation, the National Alliance for Faith and Disability, about how to engage faith communities and make them more inclusive of people with disabilities. And also our side of it is helping them support caregivers. So we're really excited. I'm going to be working with Kristen Stedman, who runs Night Lights, a respite program for children with special needs in the Metro. And we're hosting a faith conference in 2018. So we don't have full details yet, but the survey that was put out through JFK and one of the fellows last year across faith communities really identified that those communities a lot of them wanted to be more proactive in bringing in people with disabilities, but they didn't have the training or the funding to do so. And so our hope is that we can kind of step in and fill that piece. And so we're just hoping to bring, faith leaders across the metro area together, or even across the state together, and talk about how we can work together and solve this problem. Because I think it provides a very needed support for a lot of families, and it's sort of just a natural alliance. So we're also going to work with them on kind of creating little toolkits around helping them see signs of caregivers burning out, and what community resources they might be able to connect them with. Also signs of, maybe somebody's living independently and they're kind of starting to, especially like on the older adult side, they may be starting to slip a little bit, and kind of just knowing where to go and helping them see a bigger role, I guess, and keeping people in their community. We're also continuing some efforts around working with the private sector. So in kind of a different capacity, but a lot of caregivers work, and a lot of caregivers have to leave their jobs or retire early, or physically show up to work, but mentally are so distracted by their caregiving needs that it becomes a problem. And so our hope is, businesses lose literally millions and billions of dollars nationwide every year because of caregivers. And we certainly want to help businesses see that it helps their bottom line to support caregivers. This problem is not going to go away. It's only going to continue to grow. And so we're starting to have conversations with businesses around how do we create a culture in the work environment that is more supportive, and that we talk about it more, because it's certainly an issue that's hitting a lot of people. And then another piece is a program that was started in San Antonio. It's called the Stress Busting Program for Family Caregivers. We brought it into Colorado this year for the first time, which is exciting. There's 2 tracks for family caregivers. It's a 9-week course, which I know sounds intimidating, but it's well worth it. It's like 9 weeks, 90 minutes. There's one specifically for family caregivers of individuals with dementia, which we just did in the fall, and it was really, it was an amazing group of people. And then in the spring, we're going to be doing one for family caregivers of individuals with chronic conditions, which certainly includes parents of children with any type of need. So it's a pretty, they intentionally keep the classes really small so that families can really get comfortable with each other, but please feel free to share it. It's the goal is, we talk a lot about the stress of caregiving in particular, and then for every week, there's like an actual stress relief technique that they get. So they learn to color, and they learn about aromatherapy, and they learn about massage and meditation and all that. And it was really neat. In the last session, you could actually see the physical transformation even over 9 weeks of people taking care of themselves. So if you've got families that you're getting a little worried about, that would be a great thing. It's totally free. Just connect with me and I can get them set up or share more information. And then more recently, the group in Texas just recently released a professional track, which is not 9 weeks, it's 1 day. It's 8 hours, and it's really designed to prevent staff burnout and compassion fatigue. So we've got 2 people on our staff that are trained to do that. So if your organizations are interested, we're looking at like social workers, nurses, any type of respite provider, emergency responders, anybody that's in some type of caring profession. It's a much more condensed version, but definitely I think something that could help with some burnout. So we're really excited about that. Again, it's free. And just let me know if you're interested. There's more details on that. And it is being offered around the state. Because I did that many slides on that. Okay, so this is just to kind of give you a sense. This is through 2017 where we've hit across the state. There are a few very white areas that we're trying to fix right now. So we'll be going out to the eastern side of the state in 2018. But really our goal is to not be front range heavy. I think it's very natural and easy for groups to do that, and we're really trying to challenge ourselves to not do that. So if you guys have satellite offices, or if you know people in rural areas, the easiest way for us to do that is to connect with somebody. Part of why we're going to the Eastern Slope is somebody just called and said, can you help, basically, and we're not afraid of going on the road and talking to them. So, oh yeah, we haven't done that for a while. So one of our funding streams came out of, in 2012, a surcharge was created in Colorado. It's really unique. It's called the At-Risk Person Surcharge. And for every it's up to the judge, but for every offense like against a vulnerable population, there can be a fine assessed on top of everything else they're already paying. And that money it's actually exciting. So it passed in 2012, but it's like just in the last couple of years really started coming back to us because we're below child support and restitution and that kind of thing. But we made, a few years ago, we made visits to quite a few district attorneys around the state. And then in this fall, we just did another presentation to kind of remind them about it. And the funds really, again, it's not a good thing when the funds increase because obviously something happened for that to occur, but it's a very rare surcharge in that it actually comes back and it gets distributed to training and direct service. So it doesn't just sit in a pot of money somewhere. So yeah, I'm glad you asked about that. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm blowing through this, but I'm trying to save room for questions. So the other project we're doing that you might be familiar with is the Respite Care Task Force. It was a statewide group that was put together in 2015. And then last year, or in 2016, funding was actually passed to implement recommendations, which that doesn't happen very often. So that was like a small miracle in itself. But it was really exciting and I think encouraging on the state's part to see some of these things through. So we currently have a contract to manage 4 of the 7 recommendations put together by this group were funded. And we're managing that process with Department of Human Services right now. So right now it's a 2-year project. We're hoping it will be more than that. So that's some of the conversations going on with the JBC right now is seeing if there could be more funding. But I think 2 years is really exciting in itself. Okay, so there's kind of 4 key pieces to this project. We have a staff person that's really solely dedicated to this. The first is a cost benefit study. Some of this I'm not a researcher, so we are contracting this out. But really looking at what the economic value of respite care is. I mean, I think all of us in this room, like if somebody at the state recently described respite as having the duh factor, which I like. Like obviously it helps families to get a break, but it's hard to put a dollar amount on that. And so we're currently in the process of pulling Medicaid data. That's kind of the population we're focusing on first and then hope to expand. But really looking first at what's the correlation between using respite care and decrease in healthcare costs for the caregiver. And then they'd like to do additional layers of like, what are the labor force costs because they had to leave their job or other instances like that. So one kind of interesting story that came out that I think will be kind of a common theme is they recently interviewed a caregiver who solely because he was lifting his mother for so many years is now doing his 2nd rotator cuff surgery. So looking at like what the unexpected medical costs of that are as a result of just not having the support he needs. So nobody in the country has done this. It is a very daunting task for a reason, but we've tried to we have a lot of people with long degrees after their names working on it. So the plan is to have a report in June. We'll definitely keep you posted, but I may be coming. I know a few of you have actually talked to our staff about some of these projects, but don't be surprised if we come knocking with questions. Okay, so training. So we realize there's a big gap in training, I think, for professional caregivers as well as family caregivers. But we talked to quite a few people in the beginning of this process who were saying, my staff have left because they feel like they're not trained well enough and they're being put in unfair positions, which is that's not an acceptable statement, I don't think. And because of the issues of not having a license for respite providers, there's just not like a consistent manner that training is done. It's very agency by agency for the most part. So to address some of that, we are building this online training database, and I'll send you this link, but you can register any trainings you offer, whether it's for families, professionals. It's something that's more closed door or public. But we'll have a statewide training database so that you can go in and just put your zip code in and find anything. We heard from a lot of providers, like, it's sort of just one of those things that gets stuck on HR's desk and they don't have time to find it. So if we can make it easier. I think there's also a common misconception that trainings are always expensive. There are certainly expensive ones, but we're finding a surprising number of free ones. Or we're even looking at, if enough people in Colorado really wanted to bring one training in, what could we do to negotiate something? So This is something we're very much relying on actual providers to work with us on and feed, like we kind of need your trainings to build our database. But the database is going live at the end of the month. It's free, it's available for anybody, but your information will really help kind of guide us to see what the gaps are, which is was sort of the cherry on the top for realizing there was a need for behavioral trainings. That'll be kind of the next step, is figuring out what we really need to see in Colorado. And then our hope is to kind of develop these like core competencies that go between that and best practices. You know, if you're doing companionship type care, you obviously don't need the same skills as if you're doing like skilled medical care. So just kind of putting things on paper about like what's the bare minimum providers in your area should be able to have, which hopefully will help providers feel more comfortable and just make it easier for families to know what questions to ask. That's a kind of it's really hard to see, isn't it? Never mind, I was going to show you the database, but it's hard to read. We're also doing a caregiver outreach campaign over the next couple of years, just helping people who don't self-identify as caregivers. The goal is to reach caregivers first, but also just kind of, I really firmly believe caregiving is becoming a public health issue, and really want this campaign to also reach general public and get people talking about it. And it gets correlated a lot to, if you break your arm, you know to go to the ER, but caregivers don't know where to go when they're about to lose their mind. So helping people know where to go. And then we're working with the Bell Policy Center. They have a pretty daunting task as well, really looking at, like everyone, how can we improve the waiver system? And really the focus for them is the respite utilization rate is not great on waivers, and looking at what barriers are occurring within the system that we can try to address, so that families who have money for respite can actually access it, because it doesn't help anybody if it's just sitting there untouched. They're also looking at, you know, are there things that perhaps could be more simplified for center-based providers, because regulations are done out of different departments. There are a lot of people doing things over and over and over again, and maybe that's not the most efficient way. So right now they're just having a lot of conversations, and if they haven't talked to you already, there's a fairly good chance they will. But so that's, I mean, again, certainly things, we're not the first people to try to do these things, but the hope is that we can build upon, you know, work of other groups like the CLAG and kind of see what happens. So we do have an advisory committee. We do formal legislative reports to the state at the end of every fiscal year, and stay very, I mean, there are a few days that go by I don't talk to somebody at CDHS, but we do have an advisory committee, and we're always looking for more people. So if people are interested, just let us know. And then Carol, I'm looking at you because I'm going to come after you for this help with this project. So I'm really excited. We just found out a couple weeks ago that we got a grant through the Rose Community Foundation, and we're planning with that to create a toolkit that basically looks at every way you can get respite, every funding source for respite across Colorado, and a more simple way to access it, because while I 100% appreciate the work of HCPF, there are a few documents that come out of there that are not exactly easy to read. So the goal is to make it really simple. It'll be hard copies and then online, so it'll be across the lifespan. And just kind of helping, I mean, I think there's so many families that just are like, I don't even know where to start with this system. Or I finally mastered one system and now my child is in a new waiver. Like, the goal is just to make it easier. So that'll be, I mean, we have a year to do it. We're hoping to really get started this spring, but we will rely heavily on some of your expertise for what you've seen work really well. And I think the other thing I'm kind of hoping to include is I don't hate to say how to game the system, but how to find ways that may not, you know, seem like they would work traditionally, but creative ways for families to really get services, because it should not be this hard. And then I know, so Easter Seals does the policy work for this program. We're funded by the state, so my side of things stays as far away from that as possible. But really all we're planning for 2018 is to continue pushing for hopefully more state money, just because, and that's the money for our grants and our vouchers, just because there's such a big demand. we just want to see more direct services across the state. And yeah, I think like everybody else, we're just keeping our fingers crossed we can keep our funding. So I think we'll plan to be relatively quiet, but are certainly, you know, we do a lot of support for other people in legislation and just efforts on a local, statewide, and national level. So if we can be helpful to you guys, please let me know. I think that's it. This is our mantra. Any questions? Yeah, sorry, I blew through that fast. It changes every year, but right now it's a little over $1 million. But I will say that the vast majority leaves Easter Seals. We're not sitting on a pot of gold. The vast majority actually goes out to other agencies through direct service and contracting and all that. So.
Yeah, that was my interest. So how much of it goes to, I mean, you got a lot of programs there.
We do have a lot of programs.
Do you have a pie chart that kind of shows where your dollars are going?
I don't, but I could make one. It's not a bad idea. We have many grids and matrices, but not a pie chart. No, I mean, our biggest.
Well, you could do a bar graph.
Our bar graph. Yeah, our biggest program is definitely the task force right now. The vast majority of that money goes right out the door to other partners. And then the state general funds. I mean, I would say it's probably about 50% task force and then 25 for the other pieces. It changes a little bit every year just because of budgets, but yeah, it's crazy. I mean, when I started, this program had a $67,000 budget. So it's great because there's money, but there's not nearly enough. And I think another thing we're hoping to look at is there's money being left on the table with Medicaid. And so how do we, you know, I think one thing that comes up that we hear a lot with the task force is, why didn't that money go into direct service? And I get it, but if people have money sitting there and they can't access it because the system isn't working, like, we need to look at that piece first. So yeah, but no, I will work on a pie chart. I feel like I should now. No, I think it's a good idea. It is, it's confusing. I mean, honestly, it's confusing for our own staff. Yeah. Federal and state for the vast majority.
Don't actually seek the grant.
Oh, we do. Yeah,
From
I was
nonprofit.
writing a grant
Oh, you
right
do
before I
see.
walked in here today. Yeah, no, we do. I mean, the majority is federal and state, but we certainly, I mean, the Rose Community is a grant that we
Okay.
just got.
And are you looking at the databases as well for different grants?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yep. We've got a whole grants department.
Well, thank you so
You're
much.
so welcome. Yeah,
Good to
thank
see
you guys.
again.
Sure.
And we turn into a pumpkin at 12 o'clock. So thank you, the small but mighty group that's here today, and folks online.